Welcome to the NFL Slate Breakdown for DraftKings and FanDuel. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. You and I were talking a little bit before the show about FanDuel and how they divvied up the slate this weekend in terms of just two game slates. They do have the main slate, but it's a little bit lower in terms of prize pools. A little disappointing to see that from FanDuel. Actually, it's not a little, it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm gonna be focusing mainly on DraftKings this week. I had a pretty good wild card weekend, and I was looking forward to playing FanDuel. And I went to the lobby, and there just isn't anything for the 4 game slate, really. In terms of the 30 entry sort of prize pools and stuff like that, the assortment of selection is much better in DK this week. So if you are looking to play, decent exposure, especially on the smaller stakes, bigger stakes, I mean, it's pretty much, same across the board. But if you're looking at some of those smaller slates and you want to mix up your exposure, definitely go to DK.
Yeah, I agree. And, we'll kind of focus a little bit more on DK this slate breakdown, but we'll talk differences in terms of players that are better, PPR players, and of course compare them to the point 0.5 on FanDuel. But overall, I mean, it's a slate that's we've had two of these games before earlier in this year. We'll kind of break that down in terms of what's changed from those prior matchups. But let's jump into quarterbacks this week. It seems to be pretty clear cut in terms of who's the number one. I don't even think it's really close. I don't really think anyone can kind of come close to him if we do get the typical Brady game this week.
Oh, you weren't talking about Marcus Mariota?
Not unless he throws a couple touchdown passes to himself.
Yeah, I mean, Tennessee is really the only exploitable secondary other than, New England, but playoff New England is a little different than regular season New England. And, Atlanta's been able to be thrown on, but in this playoffs, they look great against the Rams last week. And their best players are playing their best and are healthy on defense right now. Keanu Neal, is that jackhammer in the secondary, and Deion Jones was all over the place. So, and it's Nick Foles. So I really didn't need to say any of that, but, I do think those two are in play, but in terms of, who the best play is, I mean, it's just, yeah.
I mean, you said like this is such an exploitable defense. We look at this New England team total, it's 30. I mean, some of the quarterbacks that have faced, Tennessee this year have kind of lightened up their fantasy points allowed, but we've seen Wilson and Watson both go for 4 touchdowns. Roethlisberger's gone for 4 touchdowns. Jared Goff's gone for 4 touchdowns against this Tennessee defense. Like, we've seen huge upside. I think he's kind of the only one who really has that clear-cut upside this week. And you mentioned Mariota. Like, I think he's kind of the number 2 for me this week because he's probably going to be a spot where he's going to have to be chasing the game. I don't think it's going to be like last week where they're going to be able to run the ball with Derrick Henry and play catch up because Kansas City was just giving basically 3 and outs the entire time in the second half. So I think this game is going to be kind of one where you want to get ahead. It's going to be with Tom Brady, but if you want to be chasing the game, I think Mariota is kind of the pivot there.
Yeah, I think in terms of the top options, it's Brady, and then I'm looking to just jump down. You mentioned Mariota. I think Matt Ryan is a really good play with price considered on DK. I think I'm going to let you go into Nick Foles a little bit more. I'm not as high on him. I think I'm focusing more on Ryan and Mariota, but I think there's major blowout potential in this Tennessee-New England game, and I think that's kind of the angle you have to be looking at with Mariota. You're looking, okay, if it's a close game, then I probably don't like Mariota because that means it's going to be low scoring. If it's a blowout, it's all based on what you think that New England offense is going to do. So if you think they're just going to blow out, the Titans and you get a bunch of Brady exposure, then you have to have Mariota lineups too with some exposure to, I don't know, Delaney or whoever you're going to use in that receiving game, because if they're up 42 to 3 in the beginning of the fourth quarter, it's going to be all Mariota garbage time, So he's actually I don't know if he's my number 2, but he's probably my number 2 this week.
Yeah, I think so, and I think between him and Matt Ryan, like it's only a $200 difference on DraftKings. I don't mind Ryan. I think a floor is relatively safe here. Like you expect Atlanta to put up some points. I just think I'm going to find myself kind of getting exposure to this passing game through Julio Jones and through Sanu here, and kind of hoping that some other guys can get a little bit higher upside, because Ryan's upside is really just the only thing that really concerns me. I mean, over the last 8 weeks, his ceiling has been 16.9. It's just been kind of a struggle for him to get anything going. But I mean, in terms of Drew Brees on the road against Minnesota, Big Ben against Jacksonville, Blake Bortles against Pittsburgh, like there's not a lot of great ways to go this week. So I think obviously Ryan's got to be in play.
Yeah, I don't love Ryan in terms of what potentially he's brought to the table this year. But, when you look at the secondaries all these other quarterbacks are facing, it's just like Drew Brees versus Minnesota, Roethlisberger versus Jacksonville. I think Keenum's the next guy we're going to talk about here, but there's just – I think Philly's secondary is exploitable, and I think really if you're playing him with Julio. It really goes back to what you think of Julio, and I think this is another week where he just dominates. I don't think anyone in Philly's secondary can contain him. So playoffs, we've seen in the past 5 or so years that the Falcons do use him a lot in the playoffs, in must-win games. He is a bigger factor, and I don't think we have to worry about what happened in the regular season as much.
And you mentioned Case Keenum is kind of the next guy we talk about here. Minnesota is interesting. The second highest team total on the slate. They're at home, 5-point favorites. I think New Orleans defense is beatable here. And I do like the running game for Minnesota against New Orleans this week, but I do like the passing game as well. And you mentioned Keenum, like he is that guy. Like I like him over Roethlisberger this week. I like him over Breeze. At 6,100 on DK, it's a viable price. And we've seen, obviously, this is a decent secondary. They have some corners, but I think with Thielen, he's pretty exploitable this week. You can look to use him. So Kyle Rudolph, I don't mind, given the fact that even he's been, hasn't been healthy the last few weeks, and New Orleans has been decent against tight ends, but the weapons are here to kind of go after and beat New Orleans this weekend, especially at home.
So, and this is a tough game to get a read on Minnesota, because if we're just looking at what they were all year, you have to be excited about this matchup, and I think I am to an extent. But there's that other end where it's Drew Brees versus Case Keenum in the playoffs, and it's like, well, I don't know. I don't know. Can I take Case Keenum, who's been fantastic this year? I don't think we can look at it any other way. He's been awesome. But kind of like last week, Rams versus Falcons, this is another one of those where I think the Vikings are clearly the superior team if we're looking at this year. But I don't know, man. Breeze is Breeze, So this is kind of more hinting towards what I actually think of that game. I'm just worried that Minnesota kind of loses control offensively. But I think Keenum's a great tournament play just because of the potential upside and how he's looked this year.
Yeah, and you mentioned Breeze, like – I think out of the tough matchups, he'd probably be the one that I'd maybe look to play the most, because you talk about the potential of Minnesota maybe struggling a little bit given the fact that Keenum is under center. I don't have that worry as much, but I can see that. I mean, if this game can turn into maybe a little bit of a shootout, kind of back and forth, like we finally saw some upside out of Drew Brees. I mean, threw for 376 yards. He was diming them to Michael Thomas and Ted Ginn. We didn't even see much out of the backfield from Ingram or Kamara. So I don't know. I mean, it's obviously Xavier Rhodes on Michael Thomas. We'll talk about that. But I still think Brees has potential here for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, even though Minnesota's been really stout against the passes here.
So I guess let's talk about the game flow of that game. Like, what do you envision? Because what I see – I think it's going to be a blowout one way or the other. Like, I think either Minnesota's defense just destroys, and doesn't allow the Saints to get those big plays and they just wax them, or I think the Saints come in there and wax them. So I don't know. It's like, I think you just game stack one side of the ball, um, and hopefully get the right piece on the other side. Cause I think this could be a blowout either way, which is bizarre to say. I just don't, this feels really volatile,
See, I see it. I think it's going to be a 27-24 game. Will Lutz or Kai Forbath is kicking a game-winning field goals. Like I think it's going to be an extremely close game.
Interesting.
I think in terms of what the New Orleans Saints defense has brought the last few weeks, and obviously their corners can match up well with Minnesota. I just think this game stays close, and I think it's going to be, there is going to be 4 or 5 touchdowns here between both sides, and I think it's pretty narrow in terms of who can get those options. So that's kind of why I like this game a little bit more. Where you have Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, you have New England, Tennessee, where there seems to be 8 or 9 guys, between those sides that can get touchdowns. It's pretty narrow in this Vikings Saints game.
I guess I just look at that as the one game that I don't know what's going to happen. I have a pretty good feeling about the other 3. I love Jacksonville's defense, but my God, Blake Bortles is, if we needed to see last week what this week's going to look like, we got it in that first quarter. And you just tune in to one. All you needed to see was that one, I forget, it was early first. It was like a 3rd down dump off. It was like 3rd and 10 to Yeldon, and he just couldn't hit him. It just went right by him. And he was airman. This is just going to be pick sixes against Pittsburgh unless they just run the ball. So what do you think of Roethlisberger?
I can't see myself using him at that price. I really can't. Mariota, Keenum, Breeze, Brady over Roethlisberger just seems like an easy decision. I just think if you're willing to take a risk in a bad matchup, I'd rather just drop down to Foles at 5,200. I know you're not a big Foles guy this week.
Well, let's talk about it, because I do see ways that it can happen, So I guess go ahead.
I look at Atlanta this year. You mentioned, the guys are healthy of late. Kind of a middle of the road pass defense for me still here, 19th in DVOA. They're kind of on par with Tampa Bay and Indy in terms of fantasy points allowed. Like, they weren't horrible, but they weren't great either. This is one where I kind of expect Atlanta to move the ball a little bit here, even on the road. And I think that helps Foles a little bit, because if this game stays close, I kind of expect a lot of Blunt and a lot of Ajayi touches. So that could also kind of decrease the upside. But if Atlanta gets out ahead here, I think Foles is in a decent spot to at least start chucking the ball. And he's got some decent targets. Threw 38 times in that Giants game. Obviously, that was his best game. He did struggle against Oakland and, only threw the ball 11 times against Dallas. But at 5,200 here, on a week where quarterback scoring could be down outside of Brady, why not take a shot at the cheap guy here?
It's tough to truly figure what the ownership is going to look like with all these options. I think it's going to be a pretty mixed bag. I think we're going to get a lot of 17 to 20%, you know what I mean, between these drop down options. They're all pretty good odds. Like you mentioned, even Foles, if you can get Foles at 9%, on a 4-game slate, that's kind of like Mariota last week. You don't love the play, but hey, fire away.
Yeah, and I think, all right, so, say Brady goes off for 25 plus. Obviously, there's an edge over there, but say Breeze, Keenum, Roethlisberger, Mariota all kind of sit in that 15 to 18 range, and you can get Foles that gets you 15 fantasy points at quite a discount.
Mm-hmm.
That $1,000 is going to get you somewhere else. It's going to bump you up from a Delaney to an Ertz, or bump you up somewhere else. Like, there's just that potential this week, because there isn't a lot of potential upside really if you play this slate out 10 times out of 10. I don't see a ton of upside outside of Brady.
Yeah, funny how things get tougher in the playoffs, because there's just not these the Browns. There's not the Browns. There isn't the Raiders. So yeah, it's a tough one. This is tough.
Yeah, and I think I can strongly say that Roethlisberger and Bortles are kind of just the two complete quarterbacks I'm off of this week.
I'll throw Roethlisberger tournament shares in there, but nothing with process in mind. You know what I mean? Sometimes you just got to throw crap at the wall, and it does hit sometimes, if you're making 20 lineups. But yeah, in terms of process, I don't think you can.
Who cleans this wall after?
Nobody. You just let it stick there. And then it gets hard, and then it becomes kind of like plaster. Keeps you a little insulation,
Oh, man. Yeah, I think we can kind of strongly qualify Brady, Mariota, Ryan, Keenum are the guys, and then Foles and Breeze are kind of the last two that I'll consider using.
Definitely.
So let's move on to running back here. An interesting week at running back. I think we can strongly say once again, like there's a clear-cut number one in Le'Veon. I think the touches are going to be there. I think both running backs are interesting in this spot because I kind of see just a grounded out game. Like it's going to be a slugfest between these two defenses and running backs.
And the difference here is if he gets 25, that is still fully paying off on this type of slate. If he gets 25 on a 12 to 14 game slate, you're kind of screwed. But on this type of slate, 9,600 on DK is tough to pay, but it's certainly viable. You're just going to have to find the drop down options at, tight end and wide receiver, which, that's
you don't love this week.
You don't love, but if you're playing Bell, that's where all your effort's going to be concentrated on. So I'd prefer some of the drop down options, but I'm not going to knock Bell. And, it depends on what his ownership is. What do we think it is at 9,600?
He'll be the highest owned back.
40%? Do you think it's over 40%? 60%?
It very well could be in the 50s this week for sure. It could be 60%. You mentioned there's not a lot of value that you feel great about, and there are some high-priced wide receivers you want some exposure to. Thielen, Jones, and obviously Gronk is going to be a guy that we want to try and get into our lineups, but he just gives you such a high floor this week. And, he's got an 18 fantasy point floor of his last 8. That's 5 points higher than Kamara, who comes second this slate, and they have the same type of upside.
So my thing is Julio and Gronk are probably, and we're getting into other positions here, but those are probably my top 2 on the board. So if you put those 2 into a DK lineup, you got 5K left. Well, I'm going to be having to look at some. I guess let's talk about some of the values. Is Tevin Coleman and his, 10 to 12 touches something you're interested in against Philly, who's pretty dominant against running backs? Ajayi you mentioned, McKinnon and Murray. I actually do think those guys are in play this week, and not just as like tournament flyers. I actually do think they're legitimate plays. What's your takes on those types?
Yeah, I like Ajayi this week. I think he's a viable RB2 flex option just because you're going to get some value. It's a middle-of-the-road defense here in Atlanta against the run. They were gashed by Gurley. It's just the problem was the Rams didn't go to Gurley until kind of late in the game. So I don't mind Ajayi. Like I said, if this game stays close, I expect kind of a lot of blunt touches, Ajayi touches, and Ajayi's slowly been kind of getting his touches up as the season went along. At 4,600 is a great option. I think Coleman's an interesting pivot. I'm a little off Freeman this week, so I think I can push a couple more shares into Coleman. Just as you said, Philly's run defense has been really good this year. They were the only team to not allow over 1,000 yards of rushing this season. They only allowed 949. It's such a tough spot for him, but I can see using both of them as kind of contrarian options. You mentioned Murray. Murray's my guy this week. I like him a lot here. New Orleans run defense is anything that I'm extremely afraid of targeting. Murray's been 20 touches in each of the last 3 games. At 5,400 on DK, like he's a tough guy to fade at RB2.
I totally agree. That's where I'm looking straight towards. I think Mark Ingram at 56 is certainly someone I'm going to be taking shots at. But Murray seems to have the easiest path to a rushing touchdown out of pretty much everyone. Not to say New Orleans is bad, they're not, but if you're playing Minnesota's defense or you think Minnesota's going to do well, I think you just plug Murray into, you get pretty decent exposure there. McKinnon's fine. I am a little more worried about his sort of touch share unless they're getting blown out. So maybe he's more of a guy you use in Drew Brees lineups. But Coleman, if he gets that touchdown and he gets you that 15, he got 9 last week, and that was actually totally viable, and he was on a lot of the winning lineups from that wild card weekend. I think that's kind of what you're looking for again, especially if you're trying to fit Julio and Gronk in there, and some of those, maybe a Thielen too. So that's what you're gonna have to do, if you're looking at that. And I wouldn't go any lower, would you?
No, I don't see it. I think Coleman and Jai are the two lowest I'd go.
Yeah.
So I think, the middle range here is somewhat intriguing. Rex Burkhead, questionable for this week. James White probably more likely to play here. If Burkhead's in, once again, it's kind of tough to figure out. If Burkhead's in, how in is he going to be? How involved is James White going to be? Is it enough to kind of take away from Lewis a little bit here? Do you think it is, or is Lewis still a viable option? They can just kind of use him once again, 20 touches here.
Personally, my take, I think Lewis is, probably the nuts. This is coming from a guy who faded him week 17, and played him week 16. Just based on how things have gone, a fully healthy Rex Burkhead takes those touches. I don't know that James White, even with a full plate of what we consider snaps for him, I don't know that he's taking away from, Lewis's featured role, because that's basically what he's doing. And I mean, I don't see how he gets less than 15 here. And if they blow him out, he could have a 3 or 4 rushing touchdown game. We've seen that, many times before.
Yeah, and this is a decent Tennessee defense against the run. I don't think they got to really truly showcase it last week because Hunt didn't get enough touches, but we've seen them in the past be pretty decent. I don't mind Lewis. He's just not at the price tag where you can kind of afford if he gets you like 12 points. If he gets you 12 points, I'm not happy at 6,600 with that from Lewis, because I do think there's probably 4 or 5 options below that can match that. So that's kind of my thing, because we've seen this in the past with Lewis where, he could drive all the way down, get 40 yards on a drive, and all of a sudden it's a dunk touchdown to Danny Amendola or Dwayne Allen or Gronk. And we're kind of out of luck here with Lewis. And with Chris Hogan back, there's so many targets for things to kind of go wrong for some of these guys that are just a little bit out of price.
Well, I wonder, with that weather, I guess that's really the thing you're going to have to keep a close eye on. If it's 20 degrees, I don't see Brady throwing 4 touchdowns in 20 degrees. If it's like 35, okay. Yeah. But I think Lewis is my cash play this week. I think he's actually not as safe, and he doesn't have as high of a ceiling as Bell, but he's right there for me.
Let's talk about Henry, Fournette, Kamara. Let's talk about Fournette here. Obviously went to town last time against Pittsburgh. That was just kind of the most perfect scenario for that Jacksonville team, where they got defensive touchdowns. They were up. They could run Fournette, 28 times, which they did for 181 yards and 2 touchdowns. Everything was perfect in that game for Jacksonville. I just don't see that obviously going 2 times in a row, but he's viable here. Pittsburgh's run defense isn't something I'm just completely staying away from.
No, it's not. And I definitely think he's viable, especially after kind of dunking all over people that played him last week. That was not optimal. But he's going to get the touches. When who was it this year? Oh, the Bears. The Bears had a primetime game this year, and they were losing like 35-3 in the early third quarter. And they were just like, nope, sorry, Mike Lennon. you're not trying to win this game. We're going to take our L, and we're just going to keep running Jordan Howard. I mean, I think that's what the Jags have to do. Like, if they're just losing, they have to just take the L. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't see them passing either way. I think Fournette's going to get 20 to 25 touches, even if they're losing by a shitload. So,
I mean, it's viable that way, but like taking an L in week 8 is so much different than taking an L in the play. If you lay down the playoffs, that is horrible.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying you just look at the Madden playbook and when the plays just get grayed out, I feel like they're going to try to pass and it won't let them. They're just going to be like, we can't pass. He's just going to throw pick 6. So,
well, the problem I kind of have too is Pittsburgh, they should be loading the box here. They should be trying to force Bortles to throw.
That's the problem.
That's my worry here. And Fournette's obviously a freak of nature, and I just don't see him going on the road and beating 9 guys in the box, kind of playing and play out. Like, it could be a very tough day for Fournette, but it also could play well. It's just if this game stays relatively close.
I'm most excited to see how the Jaguars react this week, because their defense is good enough to win this game. It absolutely is. And if Todd Haley tries to throw into this defense again, hey, I say if you're playing Fournette, play Jags D with him, because the only way I see Fournette doing really well is if the Jags D does well and puts him in good spots. So that's kind of my take there.
Yeah, and he's a viable tournament option at most here this week. He's probably my 3rd or 4th guy that I'd be looking to build lines with at running back.
Right.
Derrick Henry, I'll kind of let you talk about Derrick Henry a little bit. I'm not as big of a fan of this week as I was kind of last week with potentially using him. And by last week, I wasn't even that high on him anyway. You were.
Yeah. So this week's going to be a little different because I think Bill and Tom and all the coaches sat in the film.
I like how you talk to him first name, like you hang out Sundays, like, after the game.
I listen to a lot of WEEI, so.
You're not a 98.5 guy?
No. I go with the trash, the trash TV of radio. So they're going to look at this game and say, all right, literally the only way this offense is moving the ball is if Derrick Henry just destroys us. So I think they're just going to load the box. And I love Derrick Henry. I think he's good for 1 or 2 big plays pretty much every game that he gets 20 to 25 touches. So I think that one play is going to happen. You just have to hope it doesn't go for a touchdown if you fade him. There's also that Mariota trash, garbage time points. That's certainly viable for Henry as well. They're not going to take him out. They have nobody else to put in. But, Patriots, we've seen it in previous years with that Broncos team with Tebow.
How can I forget?
Yeah, like when bad teams go into Foxborough, it usually ends in 40-3.
We've seen Houston. We've seen Indy in the past. Bad teams that shouldn't be in the playoffs.
You just go in there and you just get overwhelmed pretty quick, and they just figured you out. Like even your scripted plays at the beginning, So it's tough. I think he's a great play. I just wonder about that ownership coming off a 30-point game.
Yeah, I do too. And if he's going to be fairly decent owned, I don't see a reason to kind of just force him into lineups this week, especially at a higher price tag. He's not what he was last week.
Right.
So, Kamara, we kind of talked about obviously Ingram here as well, but Minnesota is such a tough defense against the run. 5th in DVOA. Against pass-catching backs, they're number 1. They're only allowing 30.6 yards. This is the ultimate test because I feel like Kamara has obviously been an excellent wide receiver out of the backfield against Minnesota, who's been excellent against holding up.
Yeah, if you're going to play Kamara, I don't care about the defense, really. Like you mentioned, brutal matchup, and you have to take that into account. But if you're playing Kamara, it's going to be, okay, He's going to win that one-on-one matchup out of the backfield. He's going to get one-on-one matchups with linebackers. And I'm confident at this stage that he can do that. So if you're playing Kamara, you're really just banking on that one big play. And I've seen enough to be confident that he can do that against anyone. Obviously not optimal though. I'd prefer Ingram at price,
Yeah, I think so too. I do want to mention if James White's a full go this week, at 4,300 on DK, I don't hate it.
Sure. Yep.
Tennessee
dude had what, 200 receiving yards in the Super Bowl last year? I'm fine with it.
Well, look, 967 yards Tennessee's allowed to running backs this year.
Yeah.
That's 120 more than the Cincinnati Bengals, who came in second. Like, they got crushed by pass catching backs. And, he doesn't need to score a touchdown at his price. If he can get you 5 or 6 catches for 50, 60 yards, I'll take 12 points out of 4,300.
Absolutely. I think that's a good call and the value we're looking for.
So, yeah, he's probably the lowest. Now, the lowest I go.
There you go.
Let's move on to wide receiver this week. And, kind of a hot topic, obviously, is always going to be Antonio Brown. He's going to be in a tough matchup. Like, this last game, it's hard to really just kind of use last game as an indicator for this one because of how things went. He was force-fed targets because they were throwing the ball 50 times and because they were down, 3 touchdowns?
Yeah. What's interesting is Jalen Ramsey's one sassy man, if you've ever listened to a Jalen Ramsey interview. And he's got to be top 5, one of my favorite players in the league. He gave a lot of respect to Antonio Brown after that game, and that's not something you ever hear him do. He was like, yeah, he got me on a few plays. So a healthy Brown, I don't want 100%, but I'm not totally fading him, if I'm making 10 lineups. I think you have to entertain, the best wide receiver of the last 5 years, putting him in your playoff DFS lineups,
Yeah, he's clearly been the number 1 fantasy wide receiver, clearly the best on the slate. It's just comparing his matchup to Julio Jones is kind of what's edging Julio, I think, a lot for a lot of people because the prices are, they're basically identical.
Julio by far a better play. I just think you have to at least think about Brown. But yeah, Julio's my guy. Bailed us out with a late touchdown last week. But I think he's pretty locked into 10 plus targets a week going forward. So as long as Atlanta's alive, I'm going to be playing him, win or lose. I'm not worried about the game flow for him. So I'm pretty much locking him in.
Yeah, I am too. I think Philly's secondary is beatable. I think obviously their front seven kind of makes up for a lot of it. I know they've gotten healthy towards the end of the year. Jones, I don't really worry about here. Going to see Ronald Darby for the most part. He's been targeted the most out of Philly's side. Pretty average numbers. I think Jones kind of easily beats him. And when we look at kind of the other guys like Michael Thomas seeing Xavier Rhodes, Antonio Brown dealing with Bouye and Ramsey, Jones is a clear-cut guy here. But like you said, Brown is still a guy that you want exposure to.
Yeah, and Thielen's my number 2 this week. I think he's got a great matchup in the slot against New Orleans, gets to avoid Lattimore for the most part. So I think we're firing him away at a pretty high, exposure rate as well. Cooks, the other guy there in terms of matchup, this could be that 130-yard 2-touchdown game as well. I don't want 100% exposure, but he's a guy you're going to have to play if you're playing Brady. You're going to have to get exposure to him. So I like him a lot as well.
Yeah, I like Cooks as that GPP option this week. I think we talk about this every time we talk about Cooks. What if we don't get the ownership that we really want? What if he becomes kind of that pivot that everyone goes to because we have seen that happen
all year? It's been the same thing all year where you're like, oh, I love him as a tournament play. And then you get to Sunday and he's 25% owned. And you're like, I hate this play now. I wish, I'd rather just fade him. So I think we're heading towards that again. And it's like at this point with Cooks, one of my favorite players in the league has become, oh, yeah, well, he's a Patriot now, so everyone's going to own 40% of him. So Kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer year for me and Cooks. We had such a good relationship before. It's kind of been put on hard times, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can obviously use him this week. Are you using Michael Thomas and Stephon Diggs? You know, Diggs expect to be shadowed
No,
by Lattimore, Thomas by Rhodes.
no.
Although Thomas didn't get shadowed by Rhodes, you know, in the first matchup. We'll see if that happens again. I still think you can look at Thomas as a GPP option. Like if you're building 15 lineups, put him in one or two.
Yeah. Oh, he's definitely still playable, but he's not an optimal play, especially for the price and especially with Julio right there and Thielen right there and Cooks right there. It's just tough to fit him in, especially with the running backs you want to fit in. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So contrarian, sure. Process wise, no. Juju, I actually do think is a pretty decent play with Brown back. He's going to be taking a lot of the attention, and we've seen Juju make a lot of big plays this year. I think we could see some more of that. Obviously, he's not going for 10 targets and 143 yards, but I do think he's viable.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to see Aaron Colvin out of the slot. Obviously, he's going to dodge the two outside guys, which is a big bump for him. And like you said, the big play potential is there. You know, he could take 170 yards in one play and, you know, easily just hit value. I think he's the X factor in this passing game. I think if Jacksonville really shuts him down, as weird as that is to say with Brown, like, you know, I think they have to do a good job at limiting Juju here. If they don't, I think they do struggle a lot.
So Ginn, Sanu, Jeffrey, Hogan, I think they're all kind of the same lukewarm feeling for me where it's like, all right, I see it. Yeah. In a good situation, like in a game that goes well for their offense, I could see them all actually doing pretty well. I probably prefer Sanu of that group. But I don't mind either of the three. And Hogan, you know, tough to play him at this stage. You know, I don't know. He is one I might stay away from just because I don't know what I'm getting. But Sanu feels safest there for me.
Yeah, you got to be kind of building a lot of lineups. I think tossing Hogan. I don't hate the play because obviously, you know, he's used in the red zone. When healthy, he's been used quite a bit, basically as that wide receiver too there in New England. We don't get the discount on him, even though he hasn't played in quite some time. So that's obviously disappointing. I don't hate it, but I'm with you. I kind of rather use the other three. You mentioned Ginn. Not going to see Rose this week. Going to see Trey Waynes. I know Minnesota's obviously done a great job at limiting damage through the air, but Trey Waynes is obviously the easier corner to pick on. I like Jeffrey here. I like the Philly wide receivers quite a bit because of their value. Jeffrey's in a pretty good spot here. He's not going to see Trufant for the most part. You know, I think him and Aguilar are both interesting options here, given the fact that their matchups aren't really that bad. I know you hate, but Aguilar's been used quite a bit with Foles here.
I like Aguilar. I don't think we can take the last game as a good sample for what we're going to see. So I think it's going to be better than that, obviously. But I don't know, man. In terms of DK, I think I'd rather just take that shot on Matthews. They're sitting at 4,500. Obviously, you know, if you're going with Mariota a lot, then I think you want to get exposure to Matthews. So that's going to be my guy there instead of the Eagles. I don't mind it though, and there's definitely ways you can see the Eagles wide receivers hitting value. I do like Aguilar. If I were to choose with value considered though.
Yeah, fine. When Aguilar scores, 100 touchdowns,
hey,
whatever, it's all good.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I like him over. You and I differ here a little bit. I like him over the Tennessee guys. Tennessee this week, I mean, they have Decker who, caught the touchdown. Davis was targeted quite a bit last week. He saw 7 targets. Rashard Matthews was pretty limited. Like, he just didn't get into the game as much as I kind of wanted to. I don't mind him this week. From what I've seen out of Aguilar the last few weeks and really this season in general, I feel like he's been a better option. And Brian Poole out of the slot is a guy that I like to target.
I'll tell you who's not fun to play in DFS. Eric Decker. My goodness, he needs to retire. Holy crap. what the hell? Like, he salvaged that game with that late touchdown. He was awful. And maybe that's a byproduct of being a part of that awful offense all year, but my goodness. Again, I think Tennessee, there's gonna be targets to go around. So I think they're in play. I just don't, they're not high ownership guys. These are really when you want to dive into that Bell lineup,
Right. And
that's when you start to look to Tennessee.
And I think, well, yeah, you're rounding out wide receiver threes. This is where Tennessee kind of comes into play because they're all down here. I mean, all these guys are down here. Jacksonville guys are down here too. I do want to talk about Westbrook. I like him the most out of the Jacksonville wide receivers if you are trying to look for some exposure to them. I mean, look at Pittsburgh. They've been a middle-of-the-road kind of secondary this year at times. They've struggled a little bit of late. R.D. Burns suffered an injury here, but he's hopeful to play Sunday. That is something that we need to keep an eye on. He would be the one covering Westbrook. If he's out, I like Westbrook either way. It's just hard with Bortles. It really is.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think you can play him, be nice and low owned for you, and it's viable. They were definitely going to him more than Lee last week, which kind of indicates maybe Lee's not, 100% yet. So I do like that call.
Yep. Anyone else you want to talk about here?
I mean, we can lightly touch on tight end. I'm just going to scream, play Gronk.
Oh, I meant a wide receiver.
No, I know. I'm saying that we're done at wide receiver, and we're going to move on to this position that you're going to have the opportunity to fade, especially with roster construction. I wouldn't. I wouldn't do it. I would not do that.
It's hard here. We obviously watched Kelsey just slice up Tennessee last week before, he left injured. Titans 24th in DVOA against tight ends, 9th most fantasy points allowed over the last 5 weeks of the season. The Gronk Brady stack just seems to kind of be the way to go this week. And as chalky as it's going to be, if you hit on some of those value wideouts, if you force a Bell in there and he goes off and some of the value goes up, you can still be different.
Absolutely. I think, especially with NFL, and we've kind of talked about this with other sports as well, where, in NBA, sometimes playing a 30-40% guy isn't even a bad thing. And this is something you've kind of shown me this year. It's like, it's fine to have guys that are 30-40% as long as they're good plays. You know what I mean? And you can still be different with a lot of these value wide receivers. So I understand if you want to get two of the higher price running backs, or you want to do Thielen, Julio, I don't know, and Cooks in a lineup, then you can fade Gronk. But man, that's the easiest 20 points I ever seen.
Yeah, it's really hard to pass him up. And I mean, like, even though, like, I love Zach Ertz here too, like, I know Atlanta's been, okay against tight ends, but
play them both.
You can. That's certainly kind of where I was heading. Like, there's such a viable strategy to go with two tight ends this week because there aren't a lot of great value. Like, I know Josh Hill caught the touchdown last week. Mercedes Lewis is still getting some targets. Like, they're both under 3K DraftKings. I don't hate it if you want to completely punt the position, but there's such a difference between what Zach Ertz and Gronkowski, and even Delaney this week I still think is a viable kind of pivot, with kind of how we expect that game to go, where there could be a substantial drop-off after those three. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's any other way.
Yeah, I do look at Delaney as a guy that, okay, you can play Brady Delaney if you wanted to fade Gronk, and I actually could see that being fine. But, man, if things go, there's a lot of different ways for Gronk to get 12 targets. And if he gets 12 targets, that's 100 yards and a touchdown almost every Rob Gronkowski game. So that's that.
Yeah, simple enough. Do you like Ertz this week in all formats?
Sure. I mean, Foles is going to kill him. Foles is going to throw him right into a linebacker, one of these passes, and it's just if he can keep getting up or not, because it's brutal. So, yeah, he's fine.
I mean, he put up 217 fantasy point games under Foles,
Yep.
he's going to be that safety blanket for Foles. We've seen this way, there's a large sample size of those.
Definitely. So he's going to get on DK. FD is where it gets tougher,
Yep, I agree with you. Are you going with anyone here of the punt options of Hill or Jesse James or Lewis? Kyle Rudolph isn't cheap enough despite missing the last couple of weeks.
Not even entertaining it.
Nope, pretty easy there. Kicker is we'll talk kicker
Matt
real
Bryant.
quick for FanDuel. Are you looking at him?
Yeah, I am. I think if you like the Falcons, I think you go with Matt Bryant. Obviously, their team has been kind of trash in the red zone all year. So I think you look at, if I like Julio, I probably like Matt Bryant too. A little Denny Carter logic there. He taught me that last year. So who else are you on?
I mean, obviously, I think you can kind of take the safe bet with Gostkowski. I mean, you mentioned weather, but it doesn't affect me too much here with these Pats. They're going to move the ball. They're going to put up 35 plus points this week. Like you talked about the potential 40-point game that they can go here. And that means, 4 or 5 extra points, maybe a field goal or two for Gostkowski. I think you can take that safely, but I don't mind the kickers in the Vikings-Saints game either. I don't think Lutz or Forbat there indoors are bad options because I do think they'll be able to move the ball, but, there could be a couple drives that do stall out.
Well, you're our resident Vikings fan, so what do you think is going to happen in that game?
I do think it's coming to it's 27-24 Minnesota. Like I think it's going to come down to a field goal here. And I do think there's a couple, they're going to move the ball a little bit and we'll see defenses kind of clamp down in the red zone, which maybe means we get a little bit more kickers.
Right.
But as far as anyone else, like I'm not using suck up, maybe you can make the case for no, not even anyone in Pittsburgh. I'm really going that way.
Yeah,
defense is pretty simple for me this week. I mean, I think there's about 4 options you can use. Is Steelers pretty much a clear-cut number 1 there against Jacksonville?
Yeah. Sorry, Blake. How is there not going to be a pick 6 in this game? You know what I mean?
Maybe if he just keeps running and then gets blasted and then fumbles.
You know what? Okay. That's their one way to victory. If they just do run pass options and Blake just becomes, Alex Smith on his good days, like when he's just scrambling all over the place.
Yeah.
That's what he's going to have to do. So, okay. But for the most part, yeah, I just see Steelers rolling. I think you can play the Jags because I don't think the Steelers are going to be afraid of their secondary, which they should be. So I could see a pick 6 there. Again, I'm all in on the Falcons, so I'm riding their defense. Other than that, it's pretty tough. Pretty tough for Pats because I just worry about the garbage time.
Yeah, I think Pats just there's such a defense I don't like to play. One, I think they're overrated. I think they're bailed out by obviously an incredible coaching staff. They get bailed out by an offense that moves the ball. I don't mind them this week. I think they're going to be somewhat chalky here, so I don't really want to go there. I can see taking a shot on the Vikings at 2,900 at home. Like you said, I mean, if you're thinking that there's a potential blowout here, I mean, why not take a GPP shot with them or the Saints who are both under 3K?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you fired up for that. Yeah, hell yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm still thinking about Blake Bortles run pass options. Like you got me on that thought, and I'm like,
I
want them to run.
Pull out the NCAA 10 football playbook, and it's it's all that speed option. It's all this crap. That's
all I'm seeing right now. I'm all in on that. They could win that way. Well, they can't, but they could make that game close that way.
I would not be if the Jags made it to the Super Bowl, as crazy as it sounds. I know they would have to still go through New England. That defense is good enough. Trent Dilfer, I see the comparisons a lot to Trent Dilfer and that Baltimore team. Oh God. I mean, they're so bad on offense, but their defense is really, it's top 3 this year.
And I know it's sort of narrative street, but we look at the Jaguars still as kind of a joke.
The mic, there you go.
All right, hold on, guys. I'm coming back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're there.
Okay. I think Tom Coughlin is sort of a franchise changer in that he brings some consistency to that team. So while they are kind of a joke still, there is a reason why this team is better this year. And I think it's an organizational shift,
Yeah, I agree. And there's a belief, that they can keep this thing going and, play defense and kind of run the ball and get these wins. So, let's wrap this thing up. Who are you taking this week out of the 4 games? I think I know where you're headed here.
Yeah, I think I've made it pretty clear at this point. Atlanta, Tennessee.
Wait, Tennessee?
I'm kidding. New England, Pittsburgh, and New Orleans.
Ooh.
Let me hold on. No, I'm not giving New Orleans. I don't know. I have no freaking clue who's going to win that Saints-Vikings game. That's my answer. I have no idea.
All right. Give me Atlanta this week. Give me New England. Give me Minnesota. And give me Jacksonville with the upset. There
you go.
So it's going to wrap it up for us. We'll have another slate breakdown next week for the 2-game slate because I know they will have the 2-game slates up on FanDuel and DraftKings. So we'll be back next week to quickly talk about those. As always, you can head over, check out cheat sheets. I do have the wide receiver cornerback matchups article up for this week. Optimizers up and running as well. But good luck this week.